Hey guys, I'm super excited today because we have a super energetic person. Jackson Millan is with us and he is from Australia. So in this particular episode, you're basically gonna see or hear two different people with foreign accents, but we're trying our best to get the really strong message across. And that is, how did Jackson help more than 1,000 people get into investing, especially in real estate investing and other investments? And how can he keep up the energy to really grow the community above and beyond the boundaries of Australia? I think you will really be interested and hopefully learn something from this amazingly energetic guy. Hello and welcome to another episode on the Ideal Investor Show. Today we have an awesome guest from far away who just told me that he's about ready to go into winter, which you guys just starting on June 1st with going into summer. He is on the upside down end of the globe in Down Under. It's Jackson Millan, the wealth mentor. So welcome to the show, Jackson.
Thanks for having me, mate. I'm really looking forward to having a chat.
That's awesome. And I found out when we prepared for this that we have a bunch of similarities and hopefully and maybe some opportunities to collaborate in the future. But tell us a little bit, how did you become the wealth mentor?
Yes, so I started my wealth career at the age of 19. It was really by chance. My parents were business owners as a kid. They worked incredibly hard. My mum was a hairdresser. She had her own salon and she worked tirelessly to try and make it successful. And my old man was a tradesperson. He tried lots of different trade businesses and he was always chasing the next big buck that would skyrocket him to financial freedom. And they always said to me as a kid, Jackson, if you want to be successful in this world, you need to work hard for it. And work hard they did. I saw them work 16-hour days, 7 days a week for as long as I could remember. But they never really had much to show for it. And I very quickly discovered that the problem was that they were working for money as opposed to money working for them. They'd come from a very long track history of working class. I was actually the first person in my family in the modern era to go to university. And the real thing is that they had become a slave to their career, to their business, and they just made enough to survive. And I realized that I needed to do something to break the cycle and create a catalyst for change. So I decided to start training to become a financial advisor. Now, at 19, I joined a business called the Financial Advice Center. And Axel, this was the closest scene to the Wolf of Wall Street as you could possibly imagine. It was a bullpen of about 400 representatives, all on the phone, on auto dialers, doing outbound cold sales to banking customers, trying to sell them commission-based products that they quite frankly didn't need. And I very quickly realized that the financial advice industry really only wanted to serve two types of people. They wanted to work with people who already had wealth and they wanted to make them wealthier, and they wanted to sell commission-based products to people like my parents that weren't going to help them get closer to financial freedom. And in actual fact, it was probably going to impede their ability to create financial freedom. So I nearly hung up my hat and I nearly threw it in because I just didn't align with the values of the industry. But then I had this little voice in my head that said, Jackson, if you were going to do this differently, what would it look like? And I decided to persevere. I binned the term financial advisor. I created the term wealth coach. And I designed a framework that was all about teaching my clients the language of money to help them define what financial freedom meant and reverse engineer it into a plan, help them create wealth by turning their active income into passive wealth, and then allow them to manage their money in 30 minutes a month so they can have peace of mind and certainty around their financial future. And over the last 15 years, I've helped my clients build in excess of $1.5 billion in combined wealth and had a lot of fun along the way.
Yeah, that's awesome. Really, thank you for that kind of concise summary. Now, one of the things, and I'm sure, we will have the audience that we normally have for our show, but, I'm counting on you maybe using the link when we're done with the recording to distribute it to you guys. And I'm kind of a little intrigued because we don't often have the opportunity to talk to somebody in Australia. And I kind of wonder if you would be able to describe a little bit what's kind of like what you frequently find as the starting position that people are in when they come to you? I mean, they hear, okay, wealth coach, systematic approach, some structure. I'm sure some or all of those things are attractive. And by the way, to our audience, if you get Jackson's ebook or you go on his Facebook and stuff, if you just show him a little bit of interest, he is a master of engagement. I mean, I did this in preparation and I have so much stuff now and so many things that I can stay connected with. So I can really only applaud you on how well you do this. I wish we were there already on really like having lots of engagement and really feels like you care a lot for the people that you engage. But maybe you can describe for our audience, maybe it's the same, maybe it's different in Australia. What's kind of like the starting position when somebody says, okay, I'm not really happy with how things are going. Maybe I should hook up with Jackson and his team to see if he can help me. How does that look like?
Yeah, let me give you a crash course on it, Axel. So, what's interesting is because we are wealth coaches, we believe that the language of money is universal globally. And we work with clients all around the world because, unlike a typical financial advisor who is trying to fish for you, you hand over your money and you pay them a fee for them to manage the money and send you a pretty report. We teach our clients to fish for themselves. So they can have confidence around how they manage their money into the future, so they don't necessarily need a fiduciary or a financial advisor. And the people that we work with are actually typically not wealthy. They are business owners. They're typically at 6 or 7 figures. They've reinvested everything back into their business to create this empire that they dreamed of. Maybe they own their home, maybe they've got a little bit of wealth, but fundamentally, the common thread amongst all of them is they feel like they're falling behind financially. They see their
Okay.
friends and their family members who've amassed property portfolios that are creating passive income. They've seen people invest in the share market and be able to live on the dividends. They know that they need to do all of these things, but they just haven't had the surplus cash to do it to the level that they know they need to get from where they are to where they need to go. So what we typically work through is we take all of our clients through what we call the wealth pyramid, which is basically 5 stages to financial abundance. And the first stage that people are at is what we call financial battle. This is where we are spending more money than we're making. We're burning through our cash at a rate of knots, or potentially we're relying on debt in order to bridge that gap of our lifestyle. We're drowning financially. Stage 2, financial comfort. You live a good lifestyle, you've got enough income coming in to live comfortably, you don't go without anything, but there's nothing left over at the end of the month for you to plan with, so you're treading water financially. Stage 3 is financial growth. This is where we have a good lifestyle, but we also have a healthy surplus, and we're committing that surplus to work for us. We're buying property, we're investing in the share market, we're paying down debt, potentially all of those things. And then we've got stage 4, which is financial freedom, which I'm sure you've heard that a million times before, Axel. But what I've come to realize is that for everyone, they have a different definition of what financial freedom means to them. And I simplify it to 2 things. Financial freedom means that you own your home and it is fully paid off. And secondly, you have enough passive income or realizable investment assets where you have the freedom and flexibility to choose what you do with your time. And then stage
Yeah,
5 is financial
go ahead.
abundance. This is where we have more than what we need and we can start focusing on legacy and true generational wealth. This is where we can set up future generations to allow them to pursue their purpose and solve the real problems that we have in this world because they don't need to work for money anymore.
Yeah, that's very cool. And that's kind of like you nicely summarized why we wanted to have you on the show, because I totally agree with you that this term financial independence is a little bit overstretched by now, or worn out, however you want to call it. So as you know, we call that time freedom point, the point somewhere on the calendar where you reach exactly what you said, the freedom to use the time that you have, which I believe is the most important thing we all have in life. And we all have basically the same length of an hour, a day, a week, a month, a year. So they have the freedom to use the time for whatever you want to use it, because your life expenses are taken care of through your passive income. So there's awesome alignment there. Now the thing, actually, what you call phase 5, we call that bullshit money, right? Like when when you are back to allowing yourself to buy stuff that you probably don't really need. It's more like for joy or for helping others out or things like that. So one thing I wanted to weave in here is I saw when I looked at your website that you have something called the scorecard. How does that fit in?
Yes. So what we've worked out, because I've had the pleasure of working with thousands of clients, I've presented to tens of thousands around the world, and through surveying these individuals, we identified the top 40 things that get in the way of most entrepreneurs creating true financial freedom. And what's really interesting, Axel, is that the average score the world around is 18 out of 40, which means that the vast majority of people are below average financially, which is a little bit scary. But what we're able to work out is just by quantifying where you're at right now, and it doesn't matter if your score is 5 or if it's 35, it's just a matter of saying, cool, all right, well, whatever my score is, what are the things that I've currently answered no to that now if I focus on, I can turn into a yes over the course of the next 30, 60, 90 days. And what that then allows us to do is to minimize the sheer number of opportunities that cause us to be overwhelmed by financial choice. Because that's the problem for most people these days. They're overwhelmed by this information paralysis, this analysis paralysis of the sheer number of opportunities of things they could be doing that all sound like good ideas in isolation. The problem is that they actually don't have a lens to view their financial decisions and work out what is the right thing for them, what is going to make their financial boat go faster. So that scorecard is a really valuable resource. We do it with all of our clients. And on average, we help our clients add around about 10 points to their score in the first 12 months, which can result in multiple six figures, even seven figures in uplift in wealth trajectory as a result of the compounding of just those things alone.
Yeah, that's very cool. And I mean, when the show comes out to publishing across the different platforms, we will put a link in so people can go to the website. The scorecard button is right there, and you can see how many points you basically have out of 40. And I don't think it's a competition. It's just more like to establish a foundation or a starting point. So with that being said, when you talked earlier about creating this passive income so you can reach financial independence or time freedom point, what are the different areas that you help your clients to get passive income from? And like in our case, we have decided to stay relatively focused in the residential real estate area, but then really go deep and have all the different varieties of options in there. But I wonder if you look at this also a little bit through the lens of what's the age of the person that is interested to get your help and what's the time horizon. You mentioned the share market, so some people have enough time to go through a couple of ups and down cycles and still not be necessarily badly effective. I have seen a number of our clients who are maybe a little bit more mature and where I'm always afraid to even suggest that because, if a cycle is like what we've seen so far this year, where there's a good chance that it might take, 5, 6, 8 years to just get back to where we were. And nobody knows if we're already at the bottom or still going further down. So when you're relatively close to your retirement and you have been putting money in the share market for years in whatever kind of plan, hoping that you can draw for it. And while you're on the way to get there pretty soon, it just decides to lose 30, 40% or something like that. So I'm kind of curious if you differentiate in those different areas. You mentioned dividends, which is something we don't do. I'm not subscribing to it, but I think it might have something to do with the average age of people that come to you. So maybe you can touch on that a little bit.
I'd love to. The first thing we need to do here, Axel, is that we need to realize that money and wealth is just a vehicle, and it is a vehicle that gets us to the destination. And the choice of the vehicle will ultimately depend on where you are trying to go. So I'm an avid overlander and four-wheel driver. And if we were going to go to the middle of the desert and we were going to go and do an overlanding, we wouldn't do it in a Lamborghini. Like, a Lamborghini is a great car for all intensive purposes, but it's not fit for that particular purpose. And this is the problem and the first mistake that I see people making is that they start trying to choose the vehicle before they've even taken the time to define the destination. So one of the fundamental principles we teach is what we call the 20-year roadmap. And what this is basically doing is about us documenting all of our lifestyle and financial goals and defining the specific commodities required in order to achieve those goals, being time and or money, and then reverse engineering that backwards into an action plan. And what this allows us to do is to use this as a pass or fail filter when assessing investment opportunities. It makes it so much easier for us to choose the right investment vehicles that are fit for purpose to allow us to have the highest likelihood of achieving those milestones and goals. And I keep my investment strategy very, very simple. I'm not a believer in stock picking. I'm not a believer in active investment. I'm a big believer in asset allocation and choosing good quality, fundamentally sound investments that are going to perform well over the long term. And really, there are three ways to build wealth in this world. There is small business, of creating a business that has intrinsic value that is always ready for sale. Now, that's not for everyone, and it is inherently risky. Second thing is property. Good quality, what we call blue chip residential property. Buying properties like what you advise on, Axel, where affluent families want to live and they want to live long term, that have the underlying macro fundamentals for future performance. Because when it boils down to it, it doesn't matter where you are around the world, property comes down to supply and demand. And if we can understand the net migration, there's more people moving to an area to demand property, and property is in a scarce supply, property is going to go up. There's diverse employment, so we're not reliant on any one sector that could bring down the whole property market and have people fleeing an area, which reverses the economics and therefore results in the property market collapsing. There's infrastructure spending, both public and private. There is spending going into an area to make it more livable, to make it more enjoyable, to keep people there. Then there is a scarce amount of future supply. Like if we're on the fringe of an area in Australia, we call it greenfield land, where they can just build houses as far as the eye can see, there is not going to be a scarcity of supply, which once again messes with the economics. And similarly, if we're smack bang in the middle of a city where there is relaxed zoning restrictions where developers can build towers of apartments as high as you can see, then once again that messes with the economics. And the last one is affordability. It's not what you can afford as an investor, it is what the people who are living in that location can afford. Because property prices will go up assuming that there is enough demand to the supply, but that will only go as high as what people can afford or what the banks will lend them. So if we can understand the economics of this, then we can build a high performance property portfolio. And I'm a big believer in property. But what I'm also a believer in is that next part is the share market. Now, I've already said that I don't stock pick, so I might come across as being essentially going against what I've already said, but I invest in the stock market using index funds and ETFs. What I am doing in that respect is I am betting on a market as opposed to betting on a company. And what I believe is if we say get the S&P 500, the top 500 companies in the US, I'm very confident that over the next 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, those 500 companies are going to be better and more valuable than what they are today. And the interesting fact here, Axel, is that there's a report that's done every single year that compares professional active investors, those who are doing the stock picking, and benchmarks them against their ability to beat the index. And it's been proven the world around that over the long term, only 15% of professional active fund managers are able to outperform the index after fees and taxes. Guys, if you go online and Google SPIVA, SPIVA, there is a report that's done every year and it shows you the number of active managers that are able to outperform after fees and taxes. And that's a gamble. So build a good business if you're that way inclined, buy as much good quality property as you can, and invest in the share market in a diversified, passive, low-cost way. And then as you're approaching retirement, one of the most important things is that we are never forced to have to crystallize losses as a result of market volatility. Because this is the last point to your question, Axel. The problem that happened we saw in the GFC is that so many retirees and pre-retirees had too much exposure to the stock market because they were chasing the double-digit returns. And when they got into retirement and the market had fallen by 40%, they had no choice but to sell their portfolio at a loss. What we implement for our clients and what we teach them to do is to create a bucket strategy where we have cash for our war chest. We can draw down on to live our lifestyle for 2 or 3 years. We've got defensive assets in bonds and fixed interest and potentially some high income yielding property that provides us with security of income and also hedging against market volatility. And then we have our growth bucket, which is required to provide us with capital growth to ensure that we're not aggressively eroding our portfolio. And if we get these proportions right, then we can just ride the wave.
Yeah, that's definitely a very comprehensive approach. And like I said, I mean, that's also probably why you're so good at engaging people, because that gives pretty much everybody an opportunity, if they have a preference in any one of those 3 areas, to get some help from you. As you know, we are a little bit more narrow in our focus, basically mainly focusing on the property portfolio development, mainly because the audience that we are serving is a little bit more mature. And when you say 20-year journey or 20-year time horizon, not everybody has necessarily that much time ahead of them. One thing that I should probably throw in here for our audience, Jackson, when you were explaining this for the S&P funded, it's also important to know for those who find that to be the right place to be in investing in, that it's not the same 500 companies for 20 years. It's constantly revamped. There are some critics who say right now, if you look at the valuation of the companies in the S&P 500, the top 10 companies are like something like 80% of the value of the whole thing, and the other what is it, 490 or something like that, are not really representative to like the creme de la creme at the top. But at least there is diversification across different industries, and I think they check once a year or something like that to see if, based on valuations and a couple of other criteria, there should be a change between companies who no longer really, quote unquote, belong and should be exchanged to companies that have risen dramatically. Like I think last year, Tesla was a good example. They've gotten so big that it made sense to include them in the S&P 500. And their criteria, I think you have to have 4 or 5 quarters of profitability at minimum and a certain company size and stuff. I just wanted to point out it could be misunderstood to say, okay, I go in there, I have the 500 companies, and then I have that for 10 or 15 or 20 years. So that's really not necessarily the case. But I really think it's great that you can serve these three audiences: those who want to do business, those who want to do a portfolio, and those who want to do share or stock market. That's really great. Now, when you look at those three things that you explained, and I saw in the description that you have something that you call killer cash flow. So can you say a word on what's Jackson's killer cash flow and what do you mean by that?
Yes. So the idea, the fundamental principle of wealth creation is that we require surplus, right? Because the vast majority of people don't just run into wealth and have all of these assets that they now have to manage and have them compounding. They have to have a mechanism for converting their active income, whether that be business profit or if you're an employee, your salary and remuneration, and you need to be able to turn that remuneration into personal passive wealth. Because there are so many people that are earning massive incomes, but they suffer from what we call cash flow creep, and they end up spending all of the money that they make and never having anything to show for it. And there is this phenomena that we see is actually as the income grows, in some cases the expenses grow exponentially above and beyond. And we've seen some very wealthy individuals in terms of the income that they earn and the lifestyle that they perceive to have be almost broke, right? And we call it the rich but broke phenomena. Now, there's a principle that was taught in The Richest Man in Babylon that said, hey, out of every dollar that you earn, how much of that dollar is yours to keep? In other words, it is not what you make that matters, it's what you keep that counts. So the idea of creating killer cash flow is ensuring that you have a mechanism, a system in place to maximize your surplus and ensure that you are systematically turning that surplus into personal wealth. And we use a principle that's based under behavioral science that's called Parkinson's law. Are you familiar with Parkinson's law?
I've heard about it, but maybe for the audience, not everybody might have. So if you would explain it real quick, I appreciate it.
Yeah, let me share. So Parkinson's law is a behavioral principle that governs all of us as human beings. And it basically states that as a human, we use the means that we have available. So the more means that we have, the more means that we use. A great example that I like to use is when you were at school and you were doing an assignment and the teacher gave you 8 weeks. When do you start the assignment?
7 weeks in.
Exactly, right? You cram it at the end. And sure, there's some people out there that do the responsible thing, but I know I'm doing it the night before. But if the teacher turned around and told you that it was only 4 weeks to do the assignment, you'd do it 3 weeks in. You would always constrict and use the time available in order to meet the deadline. The
Right.
exact same thing happens with your money. And the problem is that most people's formula is income minus expenses equals surplus. We're putting surplus last. Like even in accounting principles, profit is on the bottom line. So we need to flip the formula. It needs to be income minus surplus equals expenses. And it's a really simple behavioral shift. But by presupposing the surplus will exist and taking it off the table and allocating it first, we find a way to live to the means that we've got left.
Yeah, that's brilliant. And thank you for explaining that. I call that basically pay yourself first, which is also kind of, in a sense, what the Richest Man of Babylon book kind of preaches and how he became the richest man. One of the things that goes very much along with these principles that I think are very important, and when we've talked about it, has a lot to do, and I know that you're very big on that as well, is the mindset that people develop in the context of creating wealth and becoming wealth, and maybe also adopting a wealth mindset. And for me, in that context that we were just discussing, is that I'm almost, I would say, close to preaching, that people need to be willing to turn off those indicators that they're being shown from early on, from joining college, university, coming out of high school or whatever it is these symbols of success that are oftentimes shown by somebody massively consuming, right? Like they have to have the designer clothes. Anybody that is an influencer or anybody who is like successful in music or in movies or stuff like that, they're always portrayed not so much for the role. That's when they get the Oscars and those kind of things. But when you see them in public and being basically heralded by the media, it's for the outer appearance, the beauty, the slimness, the makeup, the clothing. And then it goes on to the cars they drive, the houses they buy, the yachts they have, and stuff. And I feel there is this taking advantage of impressionable minds and impressionable people to believe that these are true signs of success. And so if I have more income, then I'm using this additional money to get more signs of success through consumption or consuming rather than things that are not so visible. I love this book, The Millionaire Next Door. I don't know if you ever heard about it, where
Yes.
you can't see necessarily the true millionaire next door by these outer appearances, because anybody who has the right wealth mindset would say, no, that I don't need 27 more shirts and even a set of pants or some. Even in the movies, they show the women with 100 pairs of shoes, right? And then that's supposedly success. And I don't mind anybody having a good chunk of shoes, but how many can you actually wear? So these kind of things, I believe, go to mindset. And that is a little bit our task. I think yours as much as mine is to find ways to help people to understand what you're being shown, what you're being told, whether it's, maxing out your credit card or consuming to the hilt and not paying yourself first, is ultimately making you part of the system, but it
Yes.
doesn't give you the individual wealth and the individual success that is not just good for you and your family, but also from a legacy perspective for your kids and their kids and on and on. And that's why I like the portfolio development so much, because when you develop these value assets, a house is easily able to withstand 50, 100, 150 years. If you go to Europe, where I come from, 1,000 years in some cases, right? So
Yes.
shouldn't just think about, how much do I need for my own retirement. Now, with that all being said, I think we went across a lot of things and demonstrated to our audience how similarly we are thinking. But I have two things I always ask at the end. I want to ask you as well, Jackson. The first one is, if you could meet anybody, who would it be and why?
That's a really good question. I'm a big believer in understanding decision-making principles. What makes people tick? Because I feel that there's so many
Okay.
people that operate on autopilot, right? And I think that goes back to the point that you were just talking about in regards to money mindset. People buy into these superficial societal pressures without even asking themselves if it's what truly makes them happy and what gets them
Right.
closer to what they want. And I think the best way for us to overcome that is to better understand what makes people tick and their decision-making principles. So I would really love to meet Nikola Tesla. I think he's one of the best creative and innovative minds of our time. And being able to understand his thought process, his method for invention and for the creation of his ideas and the drivers of innovation would be so interesting to me and be extremely fulfilling.
Yeah, that's very cool. Would you actually tell him that there will be a company with his name that's going to be there for the foreseeable future?
Yeah, I think he'd be pretty proud of that, I think that'd be safe to say.
Yeah, exactly. Especially because it carries on a lot of his ideas that were maybe a little ahead of their time, and now they finally come to fruition. Very cool. Yeah, that's a great choice. Now, the second question that I ask everybody as the final question is, if you had a time machine and you could go anywhere, forward, backward, anywhere you want, where would you go and why?
I'm a big believer in starting with the end in mind and reverse
Okay.
engineering backwards. A philosophy that I'm working on at the moment, which is all about creating generational wealth. It's a framework that I call the family vault, is about creating a 100-year
Mhm.
plan, of creating a plan that is bigger than you, that's bigger than yourself, that's bigger than your kids, and that allows you to set your family on the trajectory to create lasting generational wealth for at least the next 100 years. So I'd love to slingshot myself 100 years into the future to get a little bit of a glimpse of what the world is like. And then that would allow me to come back to today and have a deeper context to the kinds of things that I need to solve and what I need to do to make whatever the world looks like in 100 years a better place.
Yeah, and you might actually see how many people have adopted that generational plan then by then.
Fingers
All right,
crossed.
cool. Well, that's really good. And, I think that would be an interesting journey. And I would wait for you to come back and tell me, how does it look like when we get there? And did climate change actually get solved, or are we all cooking somewhere? So great. Well, thank you, Jackson, for being on the show and giving us a little bit of your wisdom and how you approach things. And I really look forward. I hope that we can collaborate going forward. So for those who say, wow, that's really cool, I want to learn about the 20-year plan, or I want to learn about the scorecard, what would you recommend? How can people get best in touch with you?
Yes, so feel free to add me on social media. I'm very active on all of the major platforms: Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, so on and so forth. Just search for Jackson Millan and you'll see my bearded face pop up. If you want to complete the scorecard, go to wealthhealthcheck.com.au. That's wealthhealthcheck.com.au. You can get the scorecard there. You can also get copies of my best-selling books, some tools, calculators, and other financial frameworks that are going to support you in working out where you are right now, what you're trying to achieve, and your best path to financial freedom. And of course, if you want to have a conversation around how we might be able to help you maximize your surplus, define your plan, and make sure that you make your money work harder, I'd love to have a conversation and see how we can support.
Awesome. And I mean, I always want to say, part of the reason we do the podcast and we bring awesome people like you, Jackson, in is because, like I said during our conversation, we and I have decided for our team that we're going to be experts really deep down the rabbit hole in one of those three areas. So anybody who says, wow, yeah, I feel like this thing that Jackson said about index funds and stock market is cool. Well, reach out to him. I trust him. I know that he is a great guy and he knows what he's talking about. So that one, for example, would be an area that we don't cover anyway, and why not help each other, right? So thank you again for
100%.
being here, Jackson, and let's stay in touch and maybe we can do it again.
My absolute pleasure and look forward to it.
Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed today's episode of the Ideal Investor Show. More info and the links we mentioned during the show are in the show notes, or you can go to our website at idealwealthgrower.com and sign up for the Apple Podcast link. And if you like to talk to me, sign up for a strategy call. Hopefully you want to share what you learned with your network and bring more people in. We are really eager to hear your comments. And until next time, be well, stay safe, and ciao.